Welcome to the deep dive. Our subject today is Gustav Klimt, a name that I think for most people immediately conjures images of dazzling gold, intense symbolism, and of course the revolutionary fin de siècle art scene in Vienna.
It does. And we're analyzing a really rich stack of sources today that cover his complex life. From his origins as a surprisingly conventional academic painter, all the way to his ascent as a symbolist master.
We'll be exploring key works, like The Kiss, obviously.
Of course, but also critically, the complicated and often very painful legacy of his art in the 20th and 21st centuries. And that story is impossible to tell without talking about the history of Nazi-looted art.
So our mission is ambitious. We want to unpack how this Austrian symbolist painter, a founding member of the Vienna Secession, effectively defined the Art Nouveau style.
And we really want to understand that profound shift he made, from academic success to scandalous rebellion, and why his canvases continue to command these astronomical prices and remain central to major international legal battles even decades after his death.
This is a deep dive into high art, immense personal transformation, and the enduring shadow of history.
I think it's crucial to understand Klimt's starting line because the ultimate financial opulence and artistic freedom we associate with his later golden phase stand in this direct, almost agonizing contrast to his origins.
Right. The foundation of his artistry wasn't laid in wealth or ease.
Not at all. It was laid in consistent, grinding financial struggle.
So let's unpack those origins. Klimt was born in Baumgarten, which is near Vienna, in 1862, and he was the second of 7 children in a family that was, well, artistically inclined, but also deeply, deeply struggling.
And that struggle started right at the top. His father, Ernst Klimt the Elder, was a gold engraver, originally from Bohemia. Now, gold engraver sounds perhaps prosperous, but
It's a craft, a trade, not high art.
exactly. And importantly, his father often struggled to find steady, profitable work. This reliant on craft wages, which were often unreliable, it led to a deeply impoverished upbringing for the entire family.
And the sources really detail the scale of this precarity. The family was forced to move no fewer than 5 times between 1862 and 1884.
5 times. Just constantly chasing cheaper rents and accommodations.
It's vital context. I mean, the man who would later use pure gold leaf to create these images of unimaginable luxury grew up defined by a lack of basic financial stability. It's such a compelling contrast.
And the struggles were compounded by tragedy. The poverty was intense, but so was the emotional toll.
I was reading that his 5-year-old sister, Anna, died after a long illness.
Yes, and his eldest sister Clara became mentally disturbed, suffering from religious obsessions. Their mother, Anna Klimt, who had actually sacrificed her own ambition to be a musical performer, suffered frequent and deep depressions because of all these hardships.
So this emotional backdrop, this atmosphere of instability and grief and unfulfilled potential, it must have profoundly shaped the young Gustav.
Absolutely. But what's fascinating here is that despite this environment, all 3 sons, Gustav, his younger brother Ernst, and Georg, all displayed significant artistic talent very early on.
They would sometimes act as models for his early sketches, right? Sort of a family artistic unit.
They did, and that talent was channeled very quickly. Klimt received a basic education, but at the relatively young age of 14 in 1876, he was accepted into the Vienna Kunstgewerbeschule.
The School of Applied Arts and Crafts.
Exactly. He studied architectural painting there, so he was essentially learning the techniques required for commercial, decorative, large-scale commissions. The bread and butter of the established art world.
And it's so crucial to stress that the Klimt we know today, the radical symbolist, he was nowhere in sight yet.
Not at all. He initially accepted all the principles of a conservative academic training. His early work is pure academic realism.
He openly revered Hans Makart, who is Vienna's undisputed foremost history painter of the time.
Makart was the establishment, known for his grand, opulent, historically themed canvases. And Klimt aspired to replicate that success through public monumental painting.
And he succeeded. He really did, at least in that initial goal. The sources highlight the professional structure that was critical to this success. The establishment of the Company of Artists.
The Künstler Company.
In 1880, Gustav, his brother Ernst, who had enrolled in the same school, and their friend Franz von Matsch formed this team. And their timing was perfect.
It was excellent because they specialized in exactly the kind of large-scale decorative work that the Booming Viennese bourgeoisie and the government were commissioning for all these new public buildings,
They collaborated extensively with a respected Viennese firm, Fellner and Helmer, who specialized in building theaters.
which involved them in these really high-level projects across the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We're talking about serious, large-format decorative painting, things like ancestral portraits for the Romanian royal palace of PLA Castle.
And painting the vaulted ceiling and theater curtain in the Carlsbad Municipal Theater in 1886.
They became known for efficient, high-quality decorative work. They were reliable.
But the pinnacle of this establishment success came with their commission for the ceiling and spandrel murals for the two grand staircases of the new Burg Theater in Vienna. I mean, this was the highest echelon of state patronage.
It was, and the recognition was immediate and completely establishment-driven. Upon the completion of the Burg Theater murals in 1888, Emperor Franz Joseph Emeritus himself awarded Klimt the Gold Cross of Merit.
The highest artistic honor in Austria at the time.
And the highest. And on top of that, he received major public acclaim for his painting audience at the Old Burg Theater, which was commissioned just before the old theater was demolished. That painting won him the newly created Kaiserpreis Award in 1890.
So this man was not a rebel. He was the future of conservative Austrian state art. He was even made an honorary member of both the University of Munich and the University of Vienna.
He was the golden boy. He had successfully escaped poverty, achieved the highest status, but that success was built on completely conventional methods.
And then came the sudden, catastrophic interruption in 1892. This is the pivot point.
It was absolutely catastrophic. Later in 1892, his father died of a stroke, and then shortly after, his brother Ernst died from pericarditis.
A double blow that just destroyed both his emotional stability and his professional structure.
The Künstler Company dissolved overnight. It was gone.
And the financial burden, which had always haunted him, it came back with a vengeance, but this time, he was the primary provider.
That's right. Klimt immediately assumed financial responsibility for both their families, his mother and sisters, and Ernst's widow and his children.
And this period of intense grief, combined with this overwhelming new responsibility, it led to a creative stall. He produced very little work right after the tragedies.
But crucially, this internal struggle, it forced the shift. It pushed him towards developing a much more personal internal style, away from the grand celebratory historical scenes and toward the psychological depth of symbolism.
He began including the figure of nuda veritas, or naked truth, in his work.
Yes, in his sketches and some works, almost as an emerging philosophical anchor. It was like he was symbolically denouncing what he saw as the hypocrisy and moral rot of Austrian society. And this personal reckoning, this is what sets the stage for the secession.
And here is where that transformation from successful academic painter to radical revolutionary is finally completed. The Vienna Secession movement, founded just 5 years after the deaths of his father and brother, became his vehicle for change.
The secession movement began in 1897, and Klimt wasn't just a member. He co-founded it and became its first president. He remained the spiritual and artistic leader until 1908.
Their goals were straightforward, but utterly radical in the conservative Viennese environment.
Absolutely. They wanted to reform Austrian art, provide exhibition opportunities for unconventional young artists, and import the works of the best foreign modernists, like Rodin and Van Gogh to Vienna.
So they were actively declaring war on the established art institution, the Künstlerhaus.
A total war. They even published their own manifesto magazine, Versacrum, or Sacred Spring, to showcase their members' work and solidify their aesthetic break.
What makes the secession so interesting is that the sources emphasized they didn't have a single manifesto or enforce a particular style.
No, that's a key point. The movement was unified by a shared antagonism toward academic conservatism, not by a single aesthetic dogma. You had naturalists, realists, and symbolists all coexisting. This kind of open-mindedness was totally unprecedented in Vienna.
And their defiance was immediately symbolized. Their symbol was Pallas Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom, the arts, and just causes. And Klimt painted his own radical version in 1898.
Which was a clear statement. They weren't just making pretty pictures. They believed their artistic revolution was a noble, righteous cause.
And Klimt doubled down on his personal defiance with the 1899 painting Nuda Veritas.
Ah, yes. It featured that starkly naked, red-headed woman holding the mirror of truth, literally confronting the viewer. This was a visual assault on bourgeois sensibilities.
And above her, in that stylized lettering, was the quotation by Friedrich Schiller, which just perfectly encapsulated Klimt's defiance of the establishment that had once honored him.
If you cannot please everyone with your deeds and your art, please only a few. To please many is bad.
It was his declaration of intellectual independence.
It's important to mention that his resentment toward his critics was not subtle at all. There's an anecdote from 1902 where Klimt wanted to title his painting Goldfish, which features a naked woman maliciously showing her rear. To my critics.
He was talked out of it, Rick.
And he was, eventually, by friends. But it reveals the extent of his contempt for the conventional art establishment he had abandoned.
And that contempt really culminated in the ultimate confrontation. The University of Vienna's ceiling commission, the infamous faculty paintings.
Yes, philosophy, medicine, and jurisprudence. These works were intended to celebrate the intellectual pillars of the state, but instead they caused a national scandal.
He received these commissions back in 1894, before the secession, but they weren't completed until 1900, and they were meant to decorate the ceiling of the University of Vienna's Great Hall.
The expectation was for comforting, traditional, allegorical figures, things representing certainty and knowledge.
And Klimt delivered the exact opposite. He transformed these traditional allegories into something far more personal, overtly sexual, and, to the critics of the time, disturbingly chaotic.
Well, take philosophy. Instead of presenting the clarity of thought, he created this chaotic mass of nude, suffering, intertwined human figures floating in a void. It represented the darkness of humanity with the head of the universe just hovering above.
And medicine depicted humanity overwhelmed by suffering and death, with these naked, emaciated figures clinging to Hygeia, the goddess of health, who's almost lost in the composition.
The overarching theme wasn't mastery or knowledge. It was despair and raw existence.
The public reaction was instant and vicious. The works were harshly criticized as pornographic.
And this wasn't just an aesthetic debate. The outcry spanned political, aesthetic, religious, and even academic quarters. Professors actively protested the use of these images to decorate a hallowed hall of learning.
The sheer political power behind the opposition was enough to ensure the paintings were never displayed on the ceiling.
No. In 1905, Klimt effectively washed his hands of the whole affair. He rejected a proposal to exhibit them elsewhere, renounced the commission, and returned the advanced money. This was Klimt's last attempt at a public commission. After that, he turned exclusively to private patronage.
It's also such a devastating detail for art history that these three paintings, philosophy, medicine, and jurisprudence, were tragically destroyed.
Yes. During World War II, they ended up in Schloss Immendorf. And when retreating German forces set the castle ablaze in May 1945, these masterpieces, along with several other significant works, were lost forever.
So the world lost these highly controversial works to the very war that would later define the legal battles around his other pieces. It's a tragic irony.
It is. And before the faculty painting fiasco concluded, Klimt presented another major work that was similarly controversial. The Beethoven Frieze, completed in 1902, for the 14th Vienna Secessionist exhibition.
This massive 75-foot-long artwork celebrated the composer, but its aesthetic was just as divisive.
It's important to remember the context of the frieze. It was meant to be temporary, painted directly on the walls with light materials, incorporating mosaics and semi-precious stones.
So it was a massive visual, textural spectacle, essentially a giant piece of applied art that blended painting and decoration.
It was. The frieze depicted the search for happiness in a dangerous world, featuring the hostile forces, a huge, gorilla-like figure representing brute strength, alongside sickness and madness, and figures representing anxiety and sexual desire. It was meant to be overwhelming.
And the face on the portrait of Beethoven, that actually resembled Gustav Mahler, right? The composer and Vienna court opera director.
Yes, a nice nod to his modernist peers.
The frieze was preserved, though it wasn't displayed again until it was restored much later, in 1986. But its initial reception just cemented Klimt's reputation. He was the man who traded comforting allegory for disturbing psychological truth, even if it meant alienating the state.
So moving beyond the public scandals, the sources give us this fascinating insight into Klimt's complex personal life, particularly his deep, lifelong relationship with Emily Louise Floge, which contrasts so sharply with his other activities.
Klimt met Emily Floge, a progressive fashion designer in the early 1890s. She was the sister-in-law of his deceased brother Ernst, and she became his lifelong companion, appearing frequently in his works.
Their bond was undeniably deep. They exchanged thousands of postcards, and she was with him right until his death. However, most scholarly sources indicate that their relationship, despite its profound closeness, likely remained platonic.
A partnership of intellectual and creative equals.
Exactly. Klimt often designed reform fashion costumes that Floge produced and modeled in his works, signifying a deep creative and professional collaboration.
It's so easy to look at the kiss, painted years later in 1907 or 8, and just assume it depicts them as lovers locked in this passionate embrace, especially given Floge's central role in his life.
But his romantic reality was far more complex. The sources confirm Klimt was very active sexually. He maintained many relationships with women, often models from upper-class circles who volunteered intimate access.
He was discreet but prolific.
Very. He fathered at least 14 children outside of his primary relationship with Floge, and after his death, the legal rights of 4 of these children were officially recognized.
This duality is striking. On one hand, the lifelong platonic companion who organized his life and business, and on the other, the numerous affairs that resulted in unrecognized offspring.
It speaks to his almost obsessive need for privacy, coupled with a total dedication to exploring raw, often explicit, sexuality in his life and art. He was very progressive in allowing women an active, liberated role in sexuality, which was highly unconventional for the time.
This blend of public scandal, private reclusiveness, and artistic rebellion continued until 1905, when the internal pressures of the secession became too much, leading to another split.
Yes, dissensions increased, particularly over aesthetic direction and the perceived corruption of some members. This resulted in a split, with Klimt leading the breakaway group.
And the following year, they formalized their new entity, the Kunstschau, or art show.
Which included influential figures like Karl Moll and Otto Wagner. This really signaled Klimt's final declaration of artistic independence from any official body.
So once Klimt had completely rejected public commissions and cemented his revolutionary status, he enters what became his most famous artistic period, the Golden Phase.
This is the era that defines him globally. This period of intense financial and critical success, marked profoundly by the spectacular use of gold leaf.
It became his trademark. We see early gold elements in Pallas Athena from 1898 and Judith I from 1901, but the phase truly blossoms with masterpieces like Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, a tourist in 1907, and of course The Kiss from 1907-08.
And this period brought him critical acclaim and, crucially, substantial financial success, a triumphant contrast to his impoverished childhood.
The inspiration for this spectacular application of gold. It wasn't entirely original, but Klimt synthesized it in a totally modern way. The sources trace it directly back to his travels.
Specifically, to trips to Venice and Ravenna. These locations are famous for their ancient, beautiful mosaics, particularly the stunning Byzantine imagery in Ravenna, which uses gold tesserae or tiles to create these shimmering, timeless surfaces.
Klimt saw how gold could flatten and modernize a figure, transforming three-dimensional reality into two-dimensional, shimmering decoration.
Exactly. This technique allowed him to merge the figure into the background, creating a unified, opulent field.
And this golden phase solidified his identity as the quintessential painter of women. He focused heavily on these large-format female portraits, often applying Art Nouveau principles of flatness, intense decoration, and gold leaf.
And these weren't just pretty society portraits. He often devoted himself to allegories or Old Testament heroines, transforming them into dangerous femme fatales.
Works like Deutolokos exemplify this perfectly. The biblical heroine who saves her people by assassinating Holofernes is depicted not as some righteous avenger, but as a seductive modern woman.
Right, gazing alluringly with her praise head barely visible at the bottom. This is where he interpreted eros, sexuality, and femininity, not just as beauty, but as an alluring, potentially deadly force. His work consistently grappled with these universal themes of life, love, and death.
One of the most significant architectural projects of this period was his collaboration on the lavish Stocklit Palace in Brussels, completed between 1905 and 1911.
The Stocklit Palace was the home of a wealthy Belgian industrialist, Adolphe Stocklit. It's regarded as one of the grandest monuments of the entire Art Nouveau movement, and Klimt's contributions to the dining room were central.
These decorative works, fulfillment and expectation, were mosaics that completely integrated the decoration and the architecture.
Klimt viewed this work as a major step forward. He stated publicly that his contribution represented probably the ultimate stage of my development of ornament. It demonstrated his mastery of blending fine art with applied arts, really fulfilling the original aims of the secession movement.
And yet, despite the provocative subject matter and the scandalous reaction to his public work, the sources all emphasize that his actual private life was quite simple. It was focused almost entirely on his art and his immediate family.
A profound contrast to the high drama of his canvases.
He cultivated a somewhat eccentric, cloistered existence. The anecdote about his work attire is telling.
He typically wore sandals and a long, loose, simple robe, often with no undergarments, while working at home or in his garden studio. He actively avoided the famous Viennese cafe society and seldom socialized with other artists.
He didn't need to chase patrons. His fame became so great, largely due to the controversy, that his clientele, primarily the assimilated Jewish Viennese high bourgeoisie, came directly to him.
Which created a highly selective, private environment for his work. And his painting method was described as very deliberate and painstaking. It required lengthy, exhausting sittings from his subjects.
He focused intensely on perfecting the decorative surface, yet somehow ensuring the psychological depth of the face and figure shone through all that ornament.
That intense focus also allowed him to maintain a high degree of privacy and discretion regarding his complex personal life, even his affairs.
We get a rare insight into his artistic philosophy from his short writing, the commentary on a non-existent self-portrait. This is significant because he otherwise kept no diary.
And he disliked discussing his art. It's a very famous and defining statement, where he essentially tells the public to judge him only by his creation.
I have never painted a self-portrait. I am less interested in myself as a subject for a painting than I am in other people, above all women. Whoever wants to know something about me ought to look carefully at my pictures.
He believed the art was the biography, and the observer's focus should remain on the work, not the man.
There's an early critique from Hermann Bahr in 1901 that seems to capture the profound emotional impact of Klimt's mature style. Bahr observed, "Just as only a lover can reveal to a man what life means to him and develop its innermost significance, I feel the same about these paintings."
That suggests that for his patrons, his art was more than decoration. It was an existential statement.
Moving into his last decade, Klimt finally achieved the international recognition that had eluded him during his scandalous secessionist period.
That recognition was formally recognized in 1911 when his painting Death and Life received first prize at the World Exhibitions in Rome.
That painting is notable because he later reworked it in 1915, right? Changing the background from that golden hue of his famous phase to a cooler blue.
Yes, perhaps signaling a further shift toward a more expressive, less ornamental phase of his work.
In 1915, his mother, Anna, died. So we see the final passing of the generation and the family members who had defined his tumultuous early years and financial responsibilities.
He carried the burden of supporting them from the age of 30.
His own end came prematurely in 1918. He was only 55. On January 11th, 1918, he suffered a stroke that paralyzed his right side, forcing him into the hospital.
And he died in Vienna on February 6 from pneumonia, which was a complication of the devastating Spanish flu pandemic that was sweeping the globe at the time.
His death left a large number of paintings unfinished, including his very last painting, Lady with a Fan. He was buried at the Heitzing Cemetery in Vienna.
The immediate aftermath of his death involved the necessary work of documenting and organizing his complicated artistic output. And the key folio sets that were produced essentially created the framework for his legacy.
Let's start with the first and most authoritative one, Das Werk Gustav Klimts. This was the only folio set produced during his lifetime, published between 1908 and 1914.
It featured 50 images of his most important paintings created between 1893 and 1913. And the production of this folio was an immense, slow labor of love, precisely because Klimt himself was supervising every single detail.
The 50 images were meticulously reproduced using collotype lithography, which is a technique known for its high fidelity.
But the process was painstakingly slow because of the delicate nature of the technique, the requirement for multicolored prints, and Klimt's own insistence on artistic perfection in the reproductions.
It was issued in a limited edition of just 300.
To emphasize its exclusivity, the first 35 editions even included an original drawing by Klimt, and each of the 50 prints had a unique signet designed by Klimt himself, impressed into the paper using gold metallic ink. It's an example of high-end, deluxe printmaking.
It's somewhat ironic, isn't it, given the faculty painting scandal, that Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria, despite having condemned his works, was the first purchaser of a folio set in 1908.
It shows that even the establishment recognized the commercial value of his rebellious genius.
And that folio set categorized the prints into 5 specific thematic areas.
Yes. Allegorical, erotic symbolist, which included works like The Kiss and Water Serpents, landscapes, which is a significant part of his work that's often overlooked, mythical or biblical, and of course portraits. This provides us with the artist's own framework for understanding his work.
But then, a year after his death, a very different publication came out that caused its own stir. 25 Handzeichnungen, or 25 drawings.
This folio was immensely polarizing, even a year after his death. It contained 25 monochrome and two-color collotype reproductions of his highly explicit erotic drawings.
I mean, we are talking about explicit scenes featuring nude women masturbating alone or coupled in sapphic embraces.
Yes, and the public exposure of these drawings had always generated hostility. When some were exhibited previously at Gallery Mietke in 1910 and an international exhibition of prints and drawings in Vienna in 1913, they were met with extreme hostility from critics and viewers alike.
But these drawings show his uncompromising focus on unvarnished sexuality. It links him so closely to the psychological explorations of the Viennese intellectual world of Freud.
The fact that they were collected and published immediately after his death underscores their significance to his full body of work. Interestingly, 15 of his more lurid depictions were selected by the Viennese poet Franz Blei for his translation of Lucian's Dialogues of the Courtesans.
And that book was able to bypass censorship.
Exactly, because the audience was composed of a small group of mostly male, affluent patrons.
The scholarly work on his drawings continues today, decades later, often driven by the extensive collection held by the Albertina Museum in Vienna.
Since 1963, the Albertina has maintained an extensive research project into Klimt's works on paper. The work, initiated by Alice Strobel's Catalogue Raisonné, has documented and classified around 400 further drawings just since 1990.
So the Albertina is the only institution in the world that has been scientifically classifying and examining his works on paper for half a century.
And it now holds information on over 4,300 drawings by Gustav Klimt. The scale of his graphic work is simply immense.
Klimt's influence today extends far beyond museums. We see his aesthetic reach right into modern culture. For example, the American photographic artist Tawny Chatmon overlays portraits of black children with gold leaf, directly citing Klimt's style,
reinterpreting his lavish, shimmering aesthetic for a modern context. And of course, the fashion world continues to draw heavily on his decorative genius. Major designers like John Galliano at Dior and Alexander McQueen have explicitly cited Klimt's geometric patterns and use of ornament in their collections. His influence is everywhere.
But as we mentioned earlier, it is his market value and his legal history that dominate his modern narrative. And this creates an uncomfortable yet essential link between aesthetic beauty and immense human tragedy.
His monetary value is staggering. The sources confirm that Klimt's paintings consistently bring some of the highest prices ever recorded for individual works of art at auction.
To give you a sense of scale, his 1907 portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I sold for $135 million in 2006, which set a record at the time for any painting sold globally.
And more recently, in 2023, his very last painting, Lady with a Fan, fetched 85.3 million pounds, or about 108.4 million US dollars. That set a record for the highest priced artwork ever sold at auction in Europe.
This immense monetary value is intrinsically and painfully linked to one of the darkest periods of European history, the Nazi looting of Jewish collections.
The story of Klimt's late success is inseparable from the story of the victims of the Holocaust, whose collections were systematically targeted.
The central narrative in this complex history is the case of Maria Altmann. She fought a protracted legal battle against the Austrian government to recover 5 paintings, including Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I, which belonged to her family.
Altmann's struggle was monumental. It lasted years and reached the U.S. Supreme Court. The legal issue was the validity of the family's forced donation to the Austrian state during the Nazi era.
She challenged the legal right of Austria to keep these paintings, which had belonged to her uncle and aunt Ferdinand and Adele Bloch-Bauer. This wasn't just about art, it was about confronting historical injustice.
And we must pause to define the crucial historical context here. When we talk about Nazi looting and forced sales in Vienna, we are referencing the period following the Anschluss in March 1938, the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany,
which immediately subjected the wealthy, cultured Jewish community of Vienna, which included many of Klimt's primary patrons, to extreme persecution, forced sales, confiscation, and eventual deportation and murder.
That is the precise context for the Altmann case. The family was forced to flee, and their magnificent collection was seized. The 5 restituted paintings, including Adele Bloch-Bauer III and Adele Bloch-Bauer II, collectively netted over $327 million upon their subsequent sale.
And the sale of Adele Bloch-Bauer I to Ronald Lauder for the Neue Gallery in New York guaranteed that this iconic piece of Viennese heritage would be permanently held outside of Europe.
It is essential to address the specific details of these injustices, showing the appropriate gravity for the victims. These were not abstract transactions, they were direct consequences of persecution.
Absolutely. The restitution efforts continue, piece by piece, decades later. In 2000, a government committee recommended that Klimt's lady with hat and feather boa, held in the Belvedere Museum, be restituted to the heirs of the Jewish family that owned it before the Anschluss.
And then there's the portrait of Ria Monk III, which was restituted to the heirs of Orenka Monk. Orenka Monk was a prominent Jewish art collector in Vienna who was murdered in the Holocaust. The portrait was of her daughter, Ria. The Lintos Art Museum in Linz returned that painting in 2009.
The injustice wasn't contained to Austria. In France, the Minister of Culture announced in 2021 that the only Klimt in France's national collections, Rose Bushes Under the Trees, was confirmed as Nazi loot and required restitution.
It belonged to Norris Diassi, who was forced to sell the painting for next to nothing in 1938, simply to survive after the persecution began, before she and her family were deported and murdered by the Nazis in 1942. The Orsay Museum had purchased it in 1980, unaware of its forced sale history.
The history continues to be uncovered. In 2023, the black feather hat was the subject of a restitution agreement between Ronald S. Lauder and the Jewish heirs of Irene Baran.
And Baran fled the Nazis, but her mother and former husband were murdered in Theresienstadt. The complexity of these cases is profound because the painting changed hands several times, often linked to figures complicit with the Nazi regime before its full provenance could be established.
Even new discoveries carry this shadow. The portrait of a young African man, Prince William Nilnordi Dowona, painted in 1897, was rediscovered in 2021.
And research confirmed it had belonged to the Viennese Jew Ernestine Klein by 1928, who was forced into exile in 1938 after the Anschluss. A restitution settlement with her heirs was subsequently reached, confirming the painful truth that virtually every Klimt work that remained in Vienna after 1938 must be scrutinized for tainted provenance.
These legal battles ensure that any discussion of Klimt's dazzling Art Nouveau today must confront these profound legal and ethical issues. His works, which celebrated beauty, life, and love, became indelible symbols of catastrophic loss and the enduring fight for justice and restitution.
Gustav Klimt was ultimately an artist defined by contradictions. A conventional, commercially successful talent who transformed himself into a radical rebel, a master of decorative, opulent surface who explored raw, sometimes disturbing sexuality, and a reclusive man who nonetheless created massive public scandals.
His early struggles with poverty, tied to the gold craft of his father, eventually gave way to a golden era of success and enduring influence that continues to shape modern art and design.
Yet, his artistic legacy is fundamentally incomplete without acknowledging the shadow of the 20th century. Many of his masterpieces, those celebratory images of beauty and life, were violently seized or sold under duress from his Jewish patrons.
The subsequent legal battles, particularly the defining Altman case, have redefined what art ownership means in the modern era and forced museums and institutions globally to face the consequences of historical injustice.
So we've covered his humble and tragic biography, his revolution through the Vienna Secession against academic complacency, his distinct golden phase inspired by Byzantine mosaics, and the high-stakes drama surrounding the restitution of his art that continues to this very day, tying his genius inextricably to human resilience.
Consider this as you look at his famous shimmering work. Though Klimt famously asked us only to look at his pictures to know him, what does it mean that the history behind his pictures, the forced sales, the legal battles, and the quest for justice for the victims of the Holocaust, has become the most important story we tell about his art today? The canvas tells a story of aesthetic revolution, but the provenance tells a far more vital story of human memory and the enduring pursuit of truth.